Welcome to the Ocean Club, sir. Checking in?
You're sitting in 1085, which has now become a legendary villa, the one and only Ocean Club. And this particular villa is where Bond seduces Solange, and it has now become famous because everybody wants to stay in that suite that Mr. Bond was in. With Casino Royale being the first book, and really the beginning of 007, it establishes immediate bond, if you will, with Paradise Island and with the Bahamas. So I think it kind of brings the whole Bond legacy full circle.
I think everybody on that island has some history with the James Bond films. It's, and they're very proud of it.
The combination of Paradise Island, James Bond, Ian Fleming, I mean, it's fantastic.
It was wonderful to come back to such a wonderful place where everybody was really welcoming Bond back because they felt that Bond had a very special place in the history of the Bahamas.
Casino Royale is not set in the Bahamas in the book, but the Bahamas is inexorably linked to the story of James Bond and inexorably linked to Bond's earliest origins.
It was fun. The Bahamas was unbelievable.
The Duke of Windsor was made governor of the Bahamas during the war. The Bahamas became a very social place.
At the time, it was for the few, it wasn't for the many, for those that were very wealthy and could have the luxury of spending not a week on holiday, it was months.
Every dinner was black tie. Most dinner party had a butler with white gloves behind each lady.
You dressed every night for dinner. You wore a black tie. You didn't go out to anybody's house without wearing a black tie.
If you went to the Cafe Martinique or any of those places, yeah, you dressed.
Everything was a little more glamorous. I have memories of black ties and gowns and balls, and it was obviously a very exciting era, and that was part of what Thunderball showed to the public.
The whole island went crazy over Thunderball.
Everybody on the island knew about it and probably had some part of it.
Everybody was trying to get into the act. My wife then was Sabila. We went to try and get in the act too.
We were asked to take part in it, so that was a big excitement. All our friends had dinner at the Cafe Martinique for 3 nights in a row, from 7 o'clock till 3 o'clock in the morning. And we thought it was terribly exciting till we discovered we were there for 1 second in the film. 1 second.
I've done a lot of other things. And the only thing that people remember is that I had this small part in Thunderball.
Oh, you're mad. Do you know that?
Yes, isn't everyone?
It's the most amazing thing. People love Bond movies. They just love Bond movies. I probably wouldn't have gotten the part if Kevin didn't think I could do it. I try to make myself feel better than having said, well, she got the part because her husband owned the island.
Diane's husband, Huntington Harford, was the man who originally built the Ocean Club.
Very few people had heard of the Bahamas till Hunt developed Paradise Island.
Huntington took Paradise Island, and it was a nothing. It was really a bunch of private houses there, and transformed it into a really, truly nice resort.
It was called Hog Island when he came, but he didn't like that name, so he asked the government if they could change it, and they did by an act of parliament.
Unlike, people like Donald Trump, who use other people's money, Hunt used his own money.
The family, in fact, owned the A&P, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company.
Well, by 1964, 1965, Huntington Hartford was facing a number of problems with Paradise Island.
When we went to do Thunderball, Paradise Island wasn't connected to
Nassau by bridge. You went across from the Mermaid Tavern by little ferry.
When he built the Ocean Club, he put in 52 rooms. And everybody was always saying to him, you don't have enough rooms. You need more rooms. If you had more rooms, you'd have more people and you'd make more money and it would support itself.
The only thing that worked at that time on Paradise Island was Paradise Beach. The Ocean Club was there, but it was closed. It was just manned by 1 or 2 people. And the Café Martinique was also closed.
He needed to bring in some more money. He needed investors.
One of the problems my uncle had with the government was that he didn't talk to the Bay Street boys, which at the time were running the Bahamas.
The Bay Street boys ran it, and Huntington Hartford, who owned Paradise Island, couldn't get the license to build a casino.
In fact, the casino you see in the film Thunderball was all shot at Pinewood Studios back in England.
Huntington always wanted to do good somehow. He wanted to do something great on Paradise Island.
Huntington Hartford's connection to Thunderball is much more complicated than the fact that he just let some of the scenes be shot on his property. The Hartford family and the Hartford fortune had been connected to Thunderball from the beginning. This is a connection that had gone on for years, and it's a trail that leads back to Ian Fleming, Fleming's connections to the Bahamas, and to a man named Ivor Bryce, who was very important in his own way in the development of 007.
Some people say that Ian based James Bond partly on Ivor Bryce. He was my uncle, and he had gone to Eton with Ian Fleming, and he'd been in the OSS.
Ivor Bryce was really Ian Fleming's oldest friend.
He was exactly the sort of best friend you'd have imagined Ian would have had, actually, come to think of it.
I met Ivor Bryce at some party in Washington during the war. He was wonderful looking. He had ink and blood. Every woman was mad about him, I suppose.
Ivor Bryce was a really attractive man whose greatest joy in life was to persuade you to do something you knew you should never do. It was. He was evil in that way.
He was a great gambler when he was early school. I suppose Ivor just felt more casually about repaying loans than most people, and so he was named burglar.
He was a Lothario. He was a really, and a bit of a criminal in his own way.
Ivor Bryce was a more satire-like figure than Ian Fleming, and he was the kind of, almost the kind of evil influence in Ian Fleming's life.
He had lived in Jamaica with his previous wife, Sheila Byrne.
Ivor was having, I think, a romance slightly with somebody. And Sheila suddenly rose quietly where she was sitting on the ground and went over to Ivor, and it appeared that she was kissing him on the cheek. However, when she moved back, blood was streaming from his face. And she had, in a rage, I suppose, just bitten through the cheek.
Ian, who, of course, wrote all the Bond books, I think was inspired by Ivor to write these books.
Ivor Bryce provided some of the more sort of salacious aspects of the James Bond lifestyle, if you like.
He always had the best champagne. He had the prettiest women surrounding him. If we went to a restaurant, we'd go to the best restaurant.
Dry martini.
Oui, monsieur.
Wait. 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half a measure of quinoa lily. Shake it over rice, and then add a thin slice of lemon peel.
Yes, sir.
He didn't like stirring, you know, which was very English in those days when you had your martini. His martinis was always shaken. Very American, isn't it, you know, with all the ice and stuff. Oh, no, no.
But there was much more James Bond in Ian than there was in Ivor.
Sorry, I should have introduced myself, seeing as we're related. Felix Leiter.
Felix Leiter was a combination of Tommy Leiter, who's Otzi Leiter's husband, and John Felix Charles Bryce, who was Ivor.
He was not a superficial man, though. He was considered extremely bright in the Secret Service.
Ian did what Ivor liked, but did it better.
When he and Ivor were together, they were wonderful because there was obviously such a close relationship between them.
Ian must have had a huge respect for Ivor because they were doing all kinds of very personal things together over many years. So clearly there was a lifetime like-mindedness.
In fact, after Fleming finished Casino Royale, the first thing he did with his brand new wife, Ian Fleming, was they flew to the Bahamas and they honeymooned with Eva Bryce and Josephine Hartford Bryce at their Bahamian house.
My mother was born Josephine Hartford. She married Eva in 1950.
Huntington Hartford had a sister who also had half of the family share of the A&P fortune, and her name was Josephine Hartford. She married Eva Bryce.
Darling Josephine, she and I were so close for so long. And I suppose at one point she was one of the richest women in America. And she never sold one share of her A&P stock.
And they were very rich, boy. They had houses all over the place.
But she sort of had no sort of sense about money.
Joe put her money in her houses and in her horses, and her husband's.
An important aspect of Eva Bryce was that he had a succession of wives. Each one was richer than the previous one.
But you know, I mean, he did like money, because he was brought up in money, and but then he got it.
It was a very successful union.
In the 40s, she bought a house in the Bahamas called Balcony House.
It was the oldest house in town.
Oh, Balcony House was wonderful. I mean, Balcony House was a whorehouse before Joe bought it.
Then when she married Eva, they built Xanadu.
Xanadu was situated on this lovely little cove. It was rather exotic and romantic.
Xanadu was a dream place. Kubla Khan was his pleasure dome, and Joe and Eva made it their pleasure dome. But in such a relaxed way, in such a fun way. I don't know any other place that was like it. And of course, Ian Fleming loved it too.
The house was by the sea, and there was a raft outside there, and everybody would be swimming and dancing, and it was really a great deal of fun.
We used to go every day for lunch to swim and bathe, and Ian got a lot of ideas.
Fleming's connection to the Bahamas actually went back before that. Fleming's mother had moved to the Bahamas a few years earlier and immediately gotten involved in a scandal.
I certainly thought she was rather splendid, old girl. And then, of course, Joe and Eva thought she was wonderful too. Well, much more charming than her son, frankly.
As you can imagine, the scandal involving his mother did not give Ian Fleming a particularly warm view towards Nassau at that time. Nassau began to grow on Fleming, though, and the adventures that Fleming had with Bryce in the Bahamas began to crop up in small ways in the Bond stories. For example, Fleming traveled with Eva Bryce to Great Anagua, the southernmost island in the Bahama chain, on a mission for, of all things, the Audubon Society.
Eva and my mother employed a guy called Pat Broom. Pat persuaded Eva to do this expedition down to the south of the Bahamas, where all the flamingos gather.
While he was there, he realized that this would be a perfect setting for a villain such as Dr. No. And so Great Anagua sort of became the fictional island of Crab Key for that book.
They were terribly adventurous. They were interested in everything, and probably always had been.
Eva didn't have any close friends, to my knowledge. He had a lot of friends, but close ones, I think Ian was probably the only one.
Mother and Eva lived the way nobody lives anymore. They lived the way James Bond would have lived if he'd been real.
He enjoyed life to the fullest, and because he was married to my mother, he could afford it.
They got into all sorts of projects, and they had a project, which was very glamorous, of some movie they made.
In 1959, Eva Bryce was in the film industry. Eva Bryce was producing a film called Boy in the Bridge with a young director, Irish director named Kevin McClory.
Eva and Joe thought he was absolutely wonderful.
The film was actually the British selection for the Venice Film Festival, but it was not well received when it was released in England. It never got a release in the United States.
The Boy in the Bridge. Oh, it was terrible. I didn't know where to put myself. It was so awful.
It was never a success.
And it sort of disappeared into obscurity except for its connection to James Bond. Because while that film was being pulled together, Bryce and his good friend Ernie Cuneo, who was an American lawyer, sort of decided that there was a great tax advantage if they could produce a film in the Bahamas. They had a filmmaker who lived in the Bahamas, Kevin McClory, who had long wanted to mount a big screen underwater epic of sorts. One of the things Ian Fleming was noted for was his writing of underwater sequences in the novel Live and Let Die. So they reached out, Ivor reached out to his best friend Ian Fleming and said, what do you think about us doing a Bond film?
And they were all the time, they discussed the possibility of doing a movie, a James Bond movie at Xanadu. That's where it was meant to be, at Xanadu.
Ernie Cuneo wrote up a sort of a scrap of an idea, and Fleming transformed that into a couple of treatments. A screenwriter named Jack Whittingham was hired, who's a very reputable and famous screenwriter in England.
After this miserable film, I think they thought about it, Ivor and Ian, that did they want Kevin to make the film?
Ivor Bryce was not that interested in it anymore. Ian Fleming went off to Jamaica and wrote his version of the story as a novel. And then when the galley proofs of that novel came out in the spring of 1961, Kevin McClory followed suit and said, you've used some of my ideas and some of Jack Whittingham's ideas, and you've not credited us.
So then there was this terrible case, and poor Ian had not been well with his heart.
Ian was at the time quite ill, and he became worse as the courtroom drama went on.
The case was really, I mean, is making everybody ill. I mean, it was making Ivor a bit ill too, you know, with all the time with lawyers, he couldn't sleep, and, you know, and I think the same with Ian, you know, they were terribly upset by all this.
So Ivor decided to stop the trial, even though he believed that they would win and his lawyers believed that they would win.
I was rather upset that he didn't go on with it, because I think he would have won it, you know. I really do, and I think he should have gone on with the case, but however, it was up to him and he didn't.
My mother was financing it, and it became quite expensive, and she decided it's better to stop it now.
They settled because Joe, my mother-in-law, it was costing her £10,000 a day.
And what Kevin McClory asked for in the settlement was credit in the front of all future editions of the book, the complete screen rights to Thunderball, and £50,000 roughly to pay for his legal fees. This money, the £50,000 in the legal fees, was paid by Jo Hartford Bryce, the sister of Huntington Hartford.
Anne, Ian's wife, was furious about this and thought that Ivor Bryce had betrayed her husband.
Anne and Ivor never got on that well, and Ian always came alone.
And then things just began to sort of fall apart. Ian died, which was totally unnecessary, but which I understand thoroughly now.
I mean, you know, Ivor was terribly upset, as he would be, you know, because Ian was a sort of childhood friend.
Kevin bought a house on Paradise Island. He was young and he was amusing. Hunt liked to have young, amusing people around him.
It is remarkable with the sense of animosity and the sense of betrayal that Ivor Bryce and Jo Hartford Bryce felt. Kevin McClory goes to Jo Hartford Bryce's brother and gets his full cooperation on this film.
He allowed them to do anything they wanted to on the island, hoping to get publicity, I expect, for the island.
For Hunt to have the crew and have the people working on Thunderball on Paradise Island was a party. I mean, so there wasn't any way he would have said no, and I don't think everybody would understand that that's why he would have them there.
There were two fronts. One side was Ivor Bryce and Jo Hartford Bryce. On the other side was Kevin and Huntington Hartford. Hunt and Jo didn't speak for a while after that. There was a hard feeling there too. And we were caught a little bit in between because we loved being on Paradise Island with Hunt. On the other hand, we could tell Ivor were very upset. They were upset that I was even in the movie.
Mother was much more straight-laced than Huntington, let's say. He was devoted to her, and I think she to him, but she disapproved of so much.
Cubby Broccoli actually reached out to Jo Hartford Bryce and Ivor Bryce and sort of forged a little bit of a friendship. Ivor Bryce said, a good friend of mine has just had a tremendous problem where his wife has had a terrible health crisis, and maybe you could find some work for him. The friend was Roald Dahl, and the woman who was having the health problems was the actress Patricia Neal, who had had some cerebral hemorrhages. This had happened in 1965, around the time Thunderball was being produced. Tremendous medical expenses that fell onto Roald Dahl and Patricia Neal's shoulders.
We didn't have a lot of money, but we needed to make money to keep out of debt.
And so Cubby Broccoli hired Roald Dahl to write the next Bond film, You Only Live Twice.
That was his first film. I am so thrilled that Eva had something to do with it.
While it was Kevin McClory that went to the premieres of Thunderball, Ivor Bryce attended the premiere of You Only Live Twice.
Huntington finally sold out to Mary Carter Paint Company, and Mary Carter changed its name to Resorts International.
Huntington Hartford had the great idea, and he couldn't get the gaming license. And the minute he sold it to the paint company, it happened.
Hunt bought things and wanted to do things that made a lot of money for the next person.
Saul Kersner, my brilliant chairman, took really a very run-down Ocean Club, a really run-down set of buildings, and created Atlantis. And now Atlantis is the largest employer in the Bahamas outside of government. You know, we have 9,000 employees here. It's one of the world's most celebrated and desirable locations.
I had been working with Jerry for a number of years to convince Michael and Barbara to bring Bond back to the Bahamas, to what I think is probably his most rightful home.
Good day, sir, and welcome to the Ocean Club.
This was kind of almost the birthplace of Bond, if you like. We're in the Bahamas. We're shooting at the one and only club. And we have at the table the wife of the man who owned the island.
Diane, who's a delightful woman. I thought that would be very sweet to bring that part of the past legacy full circle to now.
And the man who runs it,
Jerry Insurella, was at the table, who really runs Atlantis. Let's face it, I've never seen such a person with boundless energy.
It was sort of unwitting the way that happened. I didn't set out to find those people. They kind of found me. People who just watch the film won't have any idea of the background or the story or the history, but they do have an enormous history, and it was interesting to have them at the table together.
Do you want to join you?
Bond has had a long history with the Bahamas, and it was a nice way to continue the franchise going forward.
When Casino Royale went to the Bahamas to shoot in 2006, there was a link that traveled right back to Ian Fleming. When Fleming brought the typescript of Casino Royale in his suitcase with his new wife to visit his friend Ivor Bryce. The Bahamas has always been part of Ian Fleming's world, part of James Bond's world. It is so appropriate that the first Bond novel, when it was brought to be filmed, would be filmed in the Bahamas.